Hi there, Lindsay here. Today I'm going to share a bunch of oil painting tips. So if you're getting started in oils or you're curious about them, you can start off on the right foot, save some money, and get things that will really serve you well. And learn if this medium's for you or not. So I'm doing this for Sketchbook Sunday this week. The first tip I have for you is to start off with a set of good quality but inexpensive paints. So I got this set of 24 Arteza paints. You can find it on Amazon for under $20. And the thing I like about these is that they're a solid quality. They're not the best paints in the world, but they're certainly not the worst. They're decent. But what I like about starting off like this is that as you use up a color, then you can invest in a better quality paint. So let's say you use yellow ochre and ultramarine blue and burnt umber and white. You use those colors up pretty quickly. Buy those in your larger tubes of, say, like a Winton from Winsor & Newton or a Lucas Berlin if you prefer a water mixable oils, and then you can invest little by little, getting only the colors you're actually going to use. My second tip would be to use a limited palette. You can see here I've squirted out 7 colors. I actually didn't end up using the burnt sienna or the Viridian, so I'll be removing those from my palette. But by starting with a limited amount of colors, you can mix your colors, and your painting will have a much more professional look and be much more harmonious. My next tip is to start with a loose sketch in thinned down oil paint. So I'm using a traditional oil here, so I've got a jar of paint thinner off to the side, and I use that just to water down my paint a little bit so I could sketch in my boat, my shoreline, my horizon, and my mountains. Then I am blocking in some colors in my sky. You got to remember that oil paints dry very slowly, so you don't want to plan on layering too much on the first hour or so you're working on this painting. So I'm starting by blocking in. So that would be my next tip. After sketching, you want to block in color and not overdo it. Now, something that I notice a lot when I'm painting in oils or pastels is that the white is super strong. So you want to use that white sparingly and try to block in your main colors first, and then add white to tone them down. And I tend to mix that mostly on the canvas just to keep my colors fresh. You probably noticed that my canvas probably looks like it's at a weird angle for you. Well, my next tip would be to use a angled surface when you're painting or work at an easel. When you're painting with oils, the oil paint is kind of shiny because of the oil in it, so it can glare. So by tipping it up, it's going to be easier for you to see your painting without a lot of shine on it. It's also going to be a lot more comfortable for you to paint while you're sitting properly or standing so that you don't have a backache after you're done painting for the day. My next tip is to use a disposable palette if you're getting started. So this little pad of paper that you see with my paint on it, that's actually a pad of palette paper. The neat thing with oil paints is that I could scrape this off after I'm done painting if most of the paint's used up, and then I can use it over and over and over again. It doesn't get used up as quickly as acrylics because the paint's not going to dry when you're done painting. So I could scrape that off and use it probably 10 or 15 times before I need to get a new pad. So disposable palette paper is great. I would use up more paper towels and rags trying to clean a wooden palette, and then I'd have to dispose of them. So this is actually money saving and resource saving. And to clean that palette, all I do is I take a plastic palette knife and I just scrape it off, and I wipe that on my painting rag paper towel that you see on the edge of my palette, the edge of my workspace when I'm done for the day. And you really don't have to go through a lot of paper towels. My next tip would be to use paper towels and not rags, because you really don't want to be washing your oil paint rags. You definitely do not want to throw them in the dryer because they could spark a fire. So in this case, I think it's much better to use paper towels, but you don't have to go through a ton of them as you're painting. As you can see, I'm using small amounts of paint and small amounts of paint thinner, and there's really not a lot to be thrown away in the form of paper towels and cleanup. So, it doesn't have to be a really wasteful medium. My next tip also has to do with conservation, and that is with your paint thinner. So what I recommend you do is take a jar. You can either buy one that's commercially made or you can make your own. I use one that's called a silicoil, and basically what it is a jar with a screw top lid, and you could take an old spaghetti sauce jar for this that you've cleaned out, and it's got a like a screen in there. It's actually a coil of wire, but it's basically got an area where I can wipe my brush against to clean off the extra pigment, and then all the pigment falls to the bottom. So all of that dirty water or dirty paint thinner collects at the bottom. I've got fresh paint thinner up top, and then once I have like an inch or so of sludge on the bottom of that, I let it settle. I pour off the clear paint thinner, then I wipe out the sludge and discard it properly. and then I can top it off with more paint thinner. That way, none of the solvent goes to waste. I don't have to put that mineral spirits into the environment, and I get to use every bit that I've paid for. So it saves not only the environment, but also your pocketbook. So invest or make a cleaning bucket that's got like a screen in it. So I just use window screen when I made my own, or invest in a silica oil, which isn't very expensive, and I'll link that down below. And you will be using that thinner until you've used it up, instead of buying new when you've, got thinner left over. I hope that makes sense. Another money-saving, earth-friendly tip is to buy your paintbrushes once. Now, recently there have been a lot of synthetic hog brushes released, and that's wonderful if you want to have brushes that do not use animal hair. Previously, I found oil paints to be too harsh on synthetic brushes, and they would wear out too quickly, and then you would be throwing a plastic brush away. But recently, companies like Royal and Langnickel with their Menta and Zen lines, and Creative Mark with their Mimic hog brushes have come out with really wonderful faux hog bristle brushes that do hold up to oil painting and solvents and whatnot. So I would recommend investing in those. The Mentas and the Zens are the most cost effective at $5 or less a brush. Sometimes they go on sale for $10 at like AC Moore, for instance, and they will last, but only if you clean them. So to properly clean your oil painting brushes, what you want to do is remove as much as you can with your mineral spirits in your little brush cleaning tank, like I told you how to make earlier, and then wipe off the excess paint on your paper towel, and then wash it in soap and water. Now, I used to use a Master's brush cleaner, and I do recommend that, but recently I've been using lava soap because I have a lot of that on hand, and I find it works just as well. So just wash it in warm soapy water after you're done painting for the day. Now, the thing to remember here is that your brushes, once you've washed them in soapy water, need to dry completely before you use them with traditional oil paints again. If you're using water mixable oils, you can go right ahead and use your freshly washed brushes, but if you're going to use a traditional oil like I'm using today, make sure you let it dry completely. So if you're still going to plan on painting and you don't have a lot of brushes, just rinse them in the thinner, wipe them off, and keep using them. Wash them at the end of the day so you'll have time to let them dry. This next tip might be the most important tip I share on oil painting, and that is to work fat over lean. And what that means is that when you're putting your first layers down on your painting, like the pastel colors I had in the sky and the water, if you're going to add anything to that paint, you want it to be a solvent, such as a paint thinner or mineral spirits. That's going to make that film of paint dry quicker. Then on top of it, as I'm adding in my mountains, my foreground, and the darker parts of my sky, I'm using the paint full strength. That's a fatter layer because that layer has more oil in it than the previous layer that has some solvent in it. Then if I'm going to go on and add more layers, like maybe the next day or after a couple of days, I would want to add a little bit of oil to my paint. Linseed oil is what I use, and that would make an even fatter layer. So every layer you put on top of your paint should be a little bit more slower drying. And that's because your oil painting can actually take about 6 months to dry. And you want to make sure those bottom layers dry quicker than the top layers, otherwise your paint can crack. If you've ever done a crackle paint effect, either on purpose or by mistake, it works because you have a top coat that's going to dry quicker than your bottom coat, which is still moving, and that's what creates that crackle effect. That's not what you want to happen in your oil painting. So make sure you observe the fat over lean rule, which means you put your thin down layers first, and then you work thicker or oilier as you build up your painting. My next tip doesn't have anything to do with oil painting per se, but it is drawing in your mind's eye. Because when you're oil painting, it's really easy to obliterate your original sketch that you've made on your canvas. So the more you practice drawing in your sketchbook, and at times you're not oil painting, the easier it's going to be when you're doing that oil painting and you've lost the edges or the outlines of something you've sketched on, like this boat. Then you can always just quickly redraw it because you've drawn it already in your mind's eye. So that is observing, paying attention when you first put your lines down, and then committing that to memory, because you will lose details, you will lose colors, and you will need to bring them back from time to time. So just try not to be nervous. Do all the drawing you can possibly do anytime you get the chance, so that you can build that practice, and then you'll be able to keep that drawing in your mind's eye as you work through a piece, whether it be in oil paints or another medium, but especially in mediums like oil paints and pastel, where you can quickly lose your drawing if you're not careful. I really recommend you use an adjustable easel when you're painting, or something like a stack of books, or just something where you can adjust the height of your painting and the angle of your painting. So not only that you're sitting comfortably and you can paint in a comfortable fashion, because oil painting does take longer. I think this painting took me almost 3 hours, and I wasn't even aware of that until I saw all the footage that I had taken. But it's really nice to be able to angle it so that either you can rest your arm on the edge of your table and have it flat like this, or you can tip it up so you don't see glare, or you can even have it tipped all the way up so that you can kind of stand back and look at it and see how the painting really looks. So having an adjustable easel like this, it's not terribly expensive, and I'll try to find one similar to what I have here and link it down below. It will really help. Plus, this is where I typically watercolor upstairs in my office, so having this adjustable easel helps me keep all of my little over bits of like paint on that area and not on my main workspace. So it does contain my oil painting mess a little bit. The nice thing about the oil paints is they stay wet long enough that when I'm done painting for the day, if I want, I can go in and I can wipe off any oil paint that got where I didn't want it. But it's just nice to have an area where that's where I oil paint. I don't have to worry about keeping it terribly clean. Here I'm layering up, and if you find that you're at a point in your oil painting where you just can't get a bright white or you just can't get a dark dark, the best thing to do is to take a break. Usually overnight, like after about 24 hours or so, the paint will get firm enough that you can layer on top. And if you're having issues where you're lifting up the paint underneath but it's gotten a little tacky already, go with a softer brush. A softer brush will not disturb the layers underneath as much, and then you can gently almost frost those layers on top. Plus, having a slippery layer, like a layer with a little bit of linseed oil in it, or a layer that's more full strength, it will lay down on top of the thinner ones. Here you can see I'm clearing off that palette paper. Look how easy it scrapes off. There's no need to throw it away every day. If you've used up most of your paint, at the end of the day, scrape it off and you'll be fresh and good to go tomorrow. If you let it sit on there overnight, it's probably going to set up enough that you won't be able to clean it and reuse it again. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you don't have a lot of paint to save, then I would just scrape it. Now, another tip that I personally, there's two tips. The tip that I use, if you want to save your paint, I would take that little palette paper right there, that palette pad, and I would set it inside of a takeout container. You know, if you get Chinese food, it comes in those plastic containers sometimes, or like a Tupperware that you don't plan on using for food again, and seal it up in there. And that will prevent it from drying overnight. Now, I know many artists that will actually take that Tupperware container and stick it in the freezer, and they swear that doesn't harm the paint, and that will keep it fresh for even longer. So that's something you can try if you want to. I don't believe in freezing my paint just because, it just kills acrylic paint, so I don't know if it's really that great for oils, but I do know a lot of artists that do that. So if you're really desperate to save that paint, you've scored it out way too much, and you're not going to use it up in a day or two, then go ahead and pop it in the freezer, and that should keep it from drying out on you. I've never had a tube of oil paint go bad on me either, so it's probably fine to freeze, unlike acrylics. I just tend to be a little cautious with my art supplies. I have another brush tip for you. It's very important when you're oil painting that you have dedicated brushes for oils, because if you use the same brushes for oils that you used for acrylics or watercolor, not only could the oil paint and linseed oil and paint thinner damage your bristles, but you could also end up distributing those oils onto your other paintings, which with a watercolor could create spots where the paint can't stick to the paper and give you an unwanted resist. And with acrylics, it could actually prevent your acrylic paint from drying if you get a little veil of oil in there, and you could end up with the crazing or crackling of your paint finish. So it's important to have dedicated brushes for oils. Now, oftentimes I find that brushes that I've worn out that are just kind of really battered for acrylics, where acrylics tend to need a sharper, more fine brush, I find with oils, I can reuse those brushes and dedicate them to oils, and the oil paint kind of helps them stick together, helps the bristles stick together to a point so I can get more detail with them. So I recycle my old acrylic brushes for oils. Now that's fine. You can take any of your old watercolor and acrylic brushes and use them with oils, but once they've been used with oils, keep them for oils so you don't inadvertently transfer any oil back to your other mediums. My next tip has to do with detailing and saving those tiny synthetic brushes for the end. And there's two reasons for this. One reason is because if you start putting in fine details at the beginning of your painting, you saw how you kind of lose your drawing and everything gets obliterated. You want to save those details for the end. You also want to save these more traditional synthetic brushes like your Taklon brushes for the end, because they really can't take the wear and tear and abuse that your hog brushes or your synthetic hog brushes can take, because the hairs are so fine that they would easily break and get worn down. And also, to ease the wear and tear on those brushes and to make your paint flow a little nicely, or more nicely, is to use some linseed oil. And that's what I have in that little mason jar at the top of my easel there, just a little bit of Charvin linseed oil. And by adding linseed oil to your dark colors of paint, it keeps it nice and dark and transparent. So I'm able to do those little grasses that are coming up in the water there. And I'm able to keep that color nice and dark, because rather than adding an opaque color, I'm doing this really dark transparent color over the light background. You want to make sure that your background underneath has set up enough so you're not just mixing in with what you already have as well. And using a soft synthetic brush at this point really helps not disturb that underlying paint that isn't absolutely completely dry yet. My next oil painting tip is to relax and take your time. I painted this over the course of 2 days, and it was such an enjoyable experience. I forgot how much I really loved painting in oils, and part of what I loved was walking away, coming back, working on it a little bit, walking away, coming back, working on it a little bit, and it's so fun to see a painting progress. But the best part is not rushing. So you may need to set up a little extra space where you can leave that painting up and come back to it. You may have an extra easel kicking around. That would be a great place to set your painting while you're working on it, so it doesn't take up your whole workspace. It doesn't take up your whole dining room table if you've got to have dinner out. So find a place that you can keep it out so you can keep coming back to it, and take your time. Working in layers is wonderful on oils, and it gives you that richness that oil paints are known for. Now, if you want to work it all in one session, you can, and you don't have to worry so much about solvents or paint thinners, because everything is essentially in that same layer of paint, and everything will kind of jive together and dry together. But if you're going to work in layers, then you just want to keep that fat over lean rule in mind, and just relax and have some fun with it, and take your time, and just really enjoy the process. My next tip is to varnish your painting, but not too soon. 6 months after you're finished your painting, you can put down a coat of protective varnish. It comes in brush on and spray on formulas. I usually choose a brush on because I feel like it's a better finish. And there's a couple of reasons why you'd want to varnish your work. For one thing, sometimes when you're painting in oils and you're putting on those final details and you've got that oil mixed into your paint, you may have some shiny spots on the surface of your painting. And by varnishing, either with a matte varnish or a gloss varnish, whatever your preference is, it's going to even out all of that sheen. So your painting will look nice and uniform and even. It's just it looks more finished, I should say. And the other thing that's nice about having a varnish is that years down the road, if that painting gets dirty, dusty, damaged, anything happens to it, it can be cleaned. Your varnish can be removed, and then you're back down to the oil painting layer, and then a new varnish can be applied. So you can see a variety of varnishes in your art supply store and choose what is best for you. But varnishing is an important step if you want your painting to last the test of time, because you don't frame oils under glass. The varnish is essentially the glass that protects your painting. My next tip is using oil paints in your sketchbook. Yes, you can use your oil paints in your sketchbook, but you do want to protect that paper. You can actually use oils on any paper that you like. But the thing with oil paints is that you need to be careful of how you protect your surface. So with a canvas, your canvas has been sized and primed, and basically that's a layer of film. It's usually an acrylic these days, and that protects the cotton from getting damaged from the oil paints and basically rotting away, because the oil paints on raw paper or raw cloth will eventually kind of eat through that material, so you need to protect it, and acrylic gesso is a wonderful way to do that. So if you want to use oils in your sketchbook, you either want to to just save space or conserve supplies, here's what you do. Just take your acrylic gesso and just give it a couple coats. You could even do an underpainting with acrylics or acrylic gouache and then go over it with oil paints. Just make sure you allow your paint plenty of time to dry before you close your sketchbook. You'll probably find that your oil paintings in a sketchbook dry quicker because you're not using such thick passages, and if you use a good absorbent gesso, it will kind of absorb some of the oil and it will dry a little bit quicker. I wouldn't call this a very archival method, but you can actually buy, like Arches makes an oil paint, watercolor paper. It's a cotton paper meant for oils, primed for oils. So that would be archival. I probably wouldn't consider the sketchbook work to be completely archival, just because there's a chance it's going to seep through and damage a paper a bit, but it will definitely give you a place to work where you can practice and not worry so much about it. Now, the next tip that I want to share, and I might have gone into this a little bit towards the beginning of the video, and that would be to let your paint set up if you feel like you're not able to eat your bright whites or your dark darks. And that's how I was feeling originally in the sky. I couldn't get that dramatic dark shadow that I wanted. So I let this set up overnight, and then I went in with my Prussian blue and burnt umber and some linseed oil, and I was able to layer that on top. I was also able to layer some bright white on top. Now you can soften the edges of anything just by grabbing a blunt tipped brush or a mop brush or fan brush and just kind of brushing over the areas you want to soften. I would do this sparingly because you do want to keep some dramatic strokes in contrast to some softer strokes, because that contrast is what makes things look really natural and pretty. You don't want everything to be the same. You don't want everything to be perfectly lined up. You want to have something that's a little bit random in your work to make it interesting for the viewer to look at. This next tip is building depth through glazing. So you can see how my sky is getting more dramatic as I add these thin veils of dark color. We can do the same exact thing with the water. Any place that before your colors felt a little too weak and blended out, maybe the white overtook them a little bit, you can go in and glaze on more color. Just make sure that you add a little bit of oil to it so that it is going to not disturb what's underneath. It's going to dry slower and keep that fat over lean rule, and it will be archival. So that's just the basic thing you want to keep in mind. But you can go back in and rework into your oil paints quite a bit and layer on top and glaze on top until you have your painting just the way you want. So I know a lot of people with watercolor get frustrated and they feel like if I don't do it in the first go, then I've really limited my options as to how I can finish off a painting. But with oil paints, you are kind of unlimited with how much you can glaze over and add and alter as long as you follow that fat over lean rule. That's why I'm mentioning it a few times, because I just want to make sure that that it sinks in and you understand how important that is. You can kind of see how the mountains are pushing back now, and we're starting to have that boat come forward and the water with the golden highlights on it come forward, and having the clouds kind of frame, the dark clouds frame the painting. It just gives us that sense of being finished and that sense of depth. So it's all those little tricks put together that can create a finished painting. And the thing that's so fun about oil paints is that you can keep tweaking it until it's done, and you can walk away and you still can add more to it. It just gives you a little bit more time to play. The next tip, and this is something that you're going to find very early on in your oil painting career, is to buy an extra tube of white. So even though I said see what you use up for your colors in your basic paint set that's inexpensive, and then invest in higher quality paints, right off the bat though, you can go ahead, you have my permission, go buy an extra tube of titanium white, because you are going to use it. I always find that in these kind of starter kits of oil paints, they're wonderful, they get you going, but man, after a couple paintings, you're going to need another tube of white. It's almost a shame that they don't put 2 or 3 little tubes of white in there. You could probably like swap out several of the colors for whites, and it would just be much more much more useful. But you're definitely going to figure out what colors are suitable for what you like to paint, and those will be the ones that you'll invest in. Now, your oil paints are going to come in different size tubes, anywhere from the 12 milliliter tubes that come in sets like this, all the way up to 200 milliliter tubes, really big tubes of those colors that you use a lot. Colors like, for me personally, it's yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, white, burnt sienna, or burnt umber, depending on the pigments used in the company, and a permanent alizarin crimson and cadmium red. Those are the colors I tend to use a lot. Prussian blue, stuff like that, because of the things I tend to paint in oils. But you can really find any color under the sun, and once you determine what you like to paint and what you go through the most, it's not a bad idea to invest in those larger tubes. I have tubes that are 20 years old and the paint is as good as new. So you don't have to worry so much about the paint going bad as you do with acrylics. They have a much longer shelf life, and you do save quite a bit of money when you go with those larger tubes, but only if you realistically know you're going to get through them. So that would be another tip. Buy the biggest tube that you think you will use up in the next, couple of years, because it will save you some money, and it's convenient because you don't have to run out to the store whenever you need new paint. The next tip I would say is consider water mixable oils if you are painting at home and you have children or you're sensitive to fumes. I know that keeps a lot of people from trying oils because of the smell of the solvent. I use a Chelsea Studio solvent. It smells kind of like lavender, so it doesn't bother me at all. But it kept me from painting with traditional oils for a long time because my studio's at home. So a lot of times I'll use water mixable oils. My preference is the Berlin water mixable oils, and you would use water in place of paint thinner. You can still get mediums such as oil mediums to use with those, but I find with the water mixable oils, I tend to just paint all in one session a la prima, and just so I don't have to invest in a bunch of new oils and mediums. And then when I'm using my traditional oils, I do tend to use linseed oil with them. So that's definitely a option if you don't want to have the solvents around. And the water mixable oils have gotten so much better over the last decade that you really wouldn't notice that much of a difference switching over if the fumes bother you. My next tip is adding interest in a kind of boring area. So if you look down at the bottom of this painting, I've got this shore area that's really dark. It's got a bunch of straw and just dirt and stuff. And I've just got this kind of a muddy green that I've made with my yellow ochre and Prussian blue. So to give it that spark and give it a little more interest without really changing the color too much, I'm throwing in some dashes of red. And I'm using that same crimson that I used in the sky, or it's cadmium red I used in the sky. And I'm just throwing in some little grasses in there just to give it that texture, kind of reflect the sky color, and just bring it forward because it's a warm color, so that will bring that part of the painting towards the viewer more. And then I added some of that warm color also reflected onto the surface of the boat, because you would have those sky colors reflected in the boat, and having those yellows and reds there brings it forward and increases the depth on the painting. Now, something else I want to mention, so if you've gotten your paint really dark and you feel like you want to pull out some highlights, something you can do is actually scratch back. And this technique is called sgraffito, and you can do this on top of your oil paints, especially since they take so long to dry. Just use the back end of a beveled brush if you have them, like these Royal and Langnickel Fusion brushes I'm using here, or you could even use a palette knife or anything with a sharp edge, even a cut up piece of credit card, and you can scrape in, like if you wanted highlights on any of those grasses in the water, or you wanted to cut a little highlight where the water met the land or the water met the grass, you can do that so easily with the back end of a brush. And that wraps up my tips for oil painting. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed seeing this painting come together. It was so fun to paint, and it took me almost 3 hours, so please take your time and enjoy it when you paint. This is your time, you deserve it. And till next time, happy crafting.